What if everything you think you know about Henry VIII and his wives is based on propaganda? Portraits were political tools, artists flattered, enemies exaggerated, time distorted. But what if we could strip away the symbolism, the royal ego, the courtly performance, and look directly into their real faces? Before we peel back 5 centuries of myth, take a second to subscribe and like this video. If you're fascinated by hidden history, royal secrets, and the truths buried beneath legend, you're in the right place. And trust me, some of these reconstructions challenge everything we've been told. Now I want to ask you something. Which of Henry's wives do you think history has misunderstood the most? Anne Boleyn? Catherine of Aragon? Jane Seymour? Comment your answer before we begin, and let's see if the evidence changes your mind. Henry VIII and his wives. Dive into the fascinating facial reconstructions revealed. Have you ever wondered what Henry VIII and his 6 wives actually looked like, beyond the painted smiles, powdered wigs, and the myths that cling to them? Today we're peeling back varnish and rumor to reveal facial reconstructions built from the best surviving evidence: oil portraits, tiny miniatures, medals, and eyewitness descriptions. We'll walk through each wife, explain the sources and their limits, show the reconstructions and why they differ, and finish with a playful modern imagining, clearly labeled as creative speculation. Stick around to the end. You might be surprised by what's likely and what remains stubbornly uncertain. How do historians and forensic artists rebuild a face from 5 centuries ago? The short primer. Reconstructions combine 3 things: visual sources, textual descriptions, and comparative anatomy. Visual sources include full-scale oil portraits, smaller panel paintings and miniatures, often commissioned privately. And medals, those tiny, durable likenesses stamped for circulation. Textual sources are ambassadorial reports, household accounts, and letters that note hair color, complexion, stature, or distinctive marks. Finally, forensic artists and art historians use bone structure assumptions, fashion cues, which change how hair and face are framed, and digital or sculptural modeling to translate those clues into a living face. Limitations are crucial. Portraits are often idealized, medals can be schematic, miniatures compressed, and eyewitnesses biased by politics or taste. So every reconstruction you'll see is labeled with a confidence level: high, moderate, or low, and a clear list of the sources it's based on. None should be read as the real face, only as one interpretation grounded in evidence. Catherine of Aragon. Evidence, reconstructions, and myth-busting. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first queen, a Spanish princess whose marriage anchored Henry's first decades and whose daughter Mary later claimed the throne. Her life with Henry is familiar, but her face has been reshaped by centuries of portraiture and misunderstanding. Evidence inventory. The most commonly cited visual sources for Catherine include the so-called Citeaux portrait, early youthful likeness attributed to the Estonian-born painter, miniatures attributed to Lavina Teerlinck and to Gerard Hornbout, showing an older queen, and a handful of authenticated coronation and diplomatic images. There are also contemporary comments noting her complexion and hair. Important caveats. Some portraits in English collections were historically misidentified or confused with other royal women. Provenance can be contested, so when a museum labels a panel Portrait of Catherine, scholars still weigh technical analysis and costume dating. Visual synopsis. Probable features. Based on the best-supported portraits and descriptions, Catherine likely had pale skin and a rounded face, with hair tones described in some sources as reddish to auburn. Confidence, moderate. Several lifetime images present a fullness of cheek and a compact jawline consistent across early and later portrayals. Confidence, high for face shape. Eye color is less consistently recorded. A few later accounts imply blue eyes, but that remains possible rather than certain. Reconstructions presented. One reconstruction leans on the youthful Citeaux attributed likeness, soft cheeks, Wide forehead framed by the early Tudor hairline, and a warm auburn inferred from pigment traces and diplomatic notes. Confidence, moderate. The second follows the Hornbout miniature tradition for an older Catherine, a more austere, matronly visage with a steadier skin tone and the typical Tudor headdress that narrows the face visually. Confidence, high for the older look, moderate for hair tone. Why they differ. The younger Citeaux image preserves more naturalistic colouring and less royal idealization, while later miniatures are influenced by courtly fashion, heavier cosmetics, and the iconography of queenship. That explains why Hollywood often gives Catherine darker Spanish features. Those choices reflect dramatic shorthand, not archival certainty. Myth-bust. The idea that Catherine was uniformly dark-haired and swarthy is an oversimplification. Evidence supports a pale complexion and a higher probability of lighter hair tones than modern screen portrayals suggest. Anne Boleyn. The headache of a face every historian argues about Anne Boleyn has the trickiest visual dossier. She was pivotal to the English Reformation, but she left few uncontested painted portraits created during her lifetime. Evidence inventory. The key pieces are a small silver or leaded medal showing a profile with the B initial, a Holbein preparatory portrait sketch that many scholars treat as a reliable likeness in line and proportion, and the so-called Lumley portrait, photographed in 1926, which some argue may preserve a later studio copy of a lost original. Contemporary English and foreign descriptions note her dark appearance in various ways. Some call attention to a long neck, a wide mouth, and lively eyes. Provenance issues are intense here. The Lumley candidate's chain of custody and the interpretation of the Holbein sketch leave room for debate. Visual synopsis most likely features. Reconstructions often agree on a slim oval face, a pronounced jaw, and a prominent chin. A long, graceful neck is consistently reported. Confidence, high for face shape and neck. Hair color is debated. Some contemporaries imply dark hair, while others in some portraits have been interpreted as auburn or chestnut. Confidence, low to moderate. The famed beautifully dark eyes note appears in some letters, so darker eyes are possible. Reconstructions presented. One is built primarily from the Lumley photograph and later copies. A face with darker hair, finely arched brows, and the iconic elongated Tudor profile. Confidence, moderate, caveated by provenance issues. The second follows Holbein's lines from his sketch. Strong cheekbones, a slightly aquiline nose in profile, and a more neutral hair tone left intentionally ambiguous to reflect the uncertainty. Confidence, moderate to high for facial structure, low for color specifics. Why they differ. Holbein sketched Anne in a style meant for courtly realism, but not final painting. Medals capture a schematic profile, favored for circulation. Later, studio copies add fashionable softening that can change hair tone and complexion. Myth-bust. The seductress image of Anne, voluptuous and inherently guilty, owes more to Tudor politics and Victorian dramatization than to the surviving evidence about her appearance. Jane Seymour, the Holbein standard-bearer. Jane Seymour followed Anne and is often remembered as the queen who gave Henry his male heir. Her likeness benefits from clearer visual sources than Anne's. Evidence inventory. Hans Holbein's portrait of Jane is the most reliable visual source and serves as the primary basis for reconstructions. Ambassadorial and court accounts note her modest demeanor and complexion. There are fewer competing portraits, which makes alignment between text and image stronger here. Visual synopsis most likely features. The Holbein portrait shows a pale, oval face with delicate but defined cheekbones and a modest, composed expression. Hair appears darker, probably a light brown to dark blonde, and her gaze is steady. Confidence, high for facial structure and overall look. Eyewitness color notes are limited, so some fine details stay tentative. Reconstruction presented, The reconstruction modeled closely on Holbein preserves his proportions. The gable hood frames the face tightly, closing off the temples and giving an air of restraint. The result is a woman whose neat features match contemporaneous descriptions of a calm, steady companion to Henry. Confidence. High. Why it matters. Jane's portrait tradition was less politicized than Anne's, and Holbein's disciplined observation gives historians greater confidence. Myth-bust. Plainness, by modern standards, often translates into Tudor modesty and courtly expectations. Jane's appearance was likely considered attractive within her era's ideals, rather than merely plain. Anne of Cleves. The mismatch between portrait and expectation. Anne of Cleves entered Henry's life as a political ally. Her marriage famously ended in annulment after Henry claimed he was disappointed by her appearance, an episode whose visual story is more complex than Henry's exasperated notes suggest. Evidence inventory. Holbein's painted portrait of Anne of Cleves is central. It circulated as part of the negotiation process. Other Northern European images, including paintings by Barthel Bruyn and portraits in German collections, add comparative evidence. There are contemporary remarks. Some English commentators noted a brown complexion, and records mention smallpox scars in a few accounts. Provenance is generally clearer for Holbein's diplomatic portrait, but English reinterpretations later reshaped the narrative of Henry's disappointment. Visual synopsis, most likely features. Holbein's portrait suggests a dignified woman, slightly taller than the average, with a face that may read as darker in complexion relative to English queens. This could reflect regional differences in skin tone or simply pigment choices. Confidence, moderate. Smallpox scarring is possible. Confidence, low to moderate, appearing as patchiness in some later copies, but Holbein may have smoothed such details for a diplomatic representation. Reconstruction presented. The reconstruction based on Holbein's portrait shows a composed, robust face, slightly broader cheekbones, a more olive or brownish tone relative to earlier English queens, and the northern dress that frames her features differently than English gables. Confidence, moderate. A secondary view uses Bruyn's images to suggest subtle differences in cheek structure and nose shape. Confidence, low to moderate. Why Henry was disappointed? Part of the mismatch is expectation management. Holbein's small painted likeness, seen at distance, may not have matched the reality when encountering Anne in person, especially given English courtly fashions that made faces look smaller or larger depending on coiffure. Myth-bust. Henry's public humiliation of Anne is more political theatre than an objective appraisal of her looks. Many contemporaries defended her dignity. Catherine Howard, youth, rumour, and uncertainty. Catherine Howard's life was tragically short, and her visual record is the most sparse and contested among the queens. Evidence inventory. No undisputed lifetime full-scale portrait survives. There are candidate images, some miniatures, and a Metropolitan Museum piece considered possible matches. A small devotional image associated with court circle jewelry, and a few passing descriptions in letters and trial records that stress youth and vivacity. Attribution debates are strong here. Visual synopsis. What's plausible? Contemporary descriptions emphasize youthfulness, a slender build, and a fresh complexion. Confidence, low to moderate due to limited sources. Because so few images are secure, any reconstruction is tentative. Reconstructions presented. One reconstruction attempts to visualize the Metropolitan Museum candidate. Slim features, a gently rounded forehead, youthful cheeks, and hair kept high in a fashionable style of the 1540s. Confidence, low. Attribution contested. An alternate reconstruction takes a neutral approach, building from descriptions of youth and courtly fashion without committing to a specific portrait. Confidence, low. Why the uncertainty persists. The political fallout of Catherine's downfall meant that images associated with her were suppressed or altered. Many candidate portraits lack continuous provenance into the 17th or 18th centuries, so scholars must be cautious. Mythbust. Popular images that present Catherine as a ravishing beauty are often later romanticizations rather than the result of secure material evidence. Catherine Parr, Survival, Jewelry, and Identification. Catherine Parr survived Henry, and her portrait record benefits from clearer identification markers. Evidence inventory. Several portraits, particularly those associated with the artist known as Master John, are dated to the mid-1540s, and jewelry motifs, especially a crown-shaped jewel, helped scholars cross-identify images as Catherine Parr. There are also well-documented 1547 portraits and inventories that match details. Visual synopsis, most likely features. The best portraits show a woman with a sharp, intelligent face, fair to dark blonde, reddish hair in various representations, and alert greyish eyes have been suggested by some inscriptions and note-taking. Confidence, moderate for facial structure, low to moderate for exact hair and eye color. Jewelry and costume choices give us high confidence in identity, if not in fine color details. Reconstruction presented. A reconstruction based on the 1547 portrait depicts a composed, intelligent face with slightly angular cheekbones, hair pulled back to reveal a longish face, and distinguishing accessories like the crown jewel that anchor the identification. Confidence, high for identity, moderate for color specifics. Why jewelry matters. In a time when facial likenesses could be copied or misattributed, unique pieces of jewelry recorded in inventories become forensic clues. That's why Catherine Parr's reconstruction carries stronger identity confidence than several others. Henry VIII. Two very different faces, separated by time and injury. Now to Henry himself, the man behind the throne whose image was constantly managed. Reconstructions often present two main phases, the athletic young prince and the later infirm monarch. Evidence inventory. Early descriptions and portraits, most notably by Joos van Cleve and other Flemish artists, describe a tall, athletic, auburn-haired prince with a golden beard and piercing eyes. Confidence, moderate for youthful accounts. The mid-career Holbein portraits, early 1530s to 1536, present a purposeful, broad-necked monarch with cropped hair and a composed bearing. Confidence, high for Holbein's representation. Later life images, and reports about his jousting accident and subsequent chronic leg wound, illness, and weight gain, explain dramatic physical change. Confidence, high for the fact of decline. Moderate for precise medical details. Medical and visual transition. Henry suffered a severe leg injury in a 1536 jousting accident that likely introduced chronic infection, reduced mobility, and episodes of pain and ulceration. Many medical historians link these problems, and possibly metabolic or vascular changes, to his progressive weight gain and altered facial fullness. Portraiture also adapted. Even as Henry grew heavier, court painters continued to flatter or stabilize his image to emphasize regal authority. That's why Holbein's 1536 portrait, while realistic, still serves a propagandistic function. Reconstructions presented. A youthful reconstruction, based on early Flemish descriptions and paintings, shows a tall, athletic man with auburn hair, a strong jaw, and an engaged expression. Confidence, moderate. A later reconstruction, based on Holbein's mature portraits and contemporary accounts, shows a broader, heavier face with less hair and a more severe jaw set, reflecting years of illness and the changing image a king wished to project. Confidence, high for the middle and later portraits' resemblance to surviving works. Why portraits mislead. Rulers weaponize likenesses. A portrait could assert vigor or stability even as the body failed. That tension explains why Henry is simultaneously described as once called the most handsome sovereign in Europe and later memorialized in famously corpulent images. The truth is a timeline, an elegant athletic youth, a sovereign projecting power in middle age, and a body altered by injury and chronic illness in later years. A quick note about communicating uncertainty. You'll notice recurring caveats. Labels like high, moderate, and low denote confidence based on the convergence of evidence. When a reconstruction rests on Holbein's portrait and corroborating written notes, confidence rises. When it depends on a contested miniature or a later copy, confidence drops. Responsible presentation means always making those degrees explicit. Sponsor message. Integrated mid-roll. This episode is brought to you by Time Reads, my go-to app for historical audiobooks. When I'm reading through dusty diplomatic reports or comparing miniatures across collections, Time Reads helps me layer secondary scholarship and audio commentary without switching tabs. If you love deep dives into the past, the way I do, it's a simple way to keep good sources close while you watch. Now back to the reconstructions. Modern reimagining, clearly speculative. Let's have a little creative fun, clearly speculative and not historical claim, by imagining how each of these figures might look if transported into the modern day. These are playful reinterpretations, useful to show how hairstyle, clothing, and cultural framing shape perception. Catherine of Aragon as a modern diplomat. Keep the round face and pale complexion, auburn hair pulled back in a professional chignon, minimal jewelry, someone with a quiet gravitas and an affinity for classic tailoring, speculative exercise, confidence in historic likeness, moderate. Anne Boleyn as a contemporary cultural figure, slim, predatory in her charisma rather than appearance, smartly dressed, with an ambiguous hair color in photographs that becomes a talking point in tabloids. Long neck and sharp profile make her instantly recognizable, speculative, confidence in structure, high in color, low. Jane Seymour as a modern public health advocate, steady, approachable, wearing understated jewelry, her severity softened into warmth. Someone whose photographed presence evokes sympathy and reliability, echoing Holbein's restrained pose, speculative, confidence in likeness basics, high. Anne of Cleves as an international NGO leader, tall, composed, with a slightly olive tone and a fashion sense that reads Northern European rather than English, projecting competence rather than the scandalized disappointment which historical accounts emphasize. Speculative, confidence, moderate. Catherine Howard as a young, fast-rising influencer. The modern translation of her youth and vivacity, though presented with caution because her historical record is so uncertain. This is the least evidence-based modern take. Speculative, confidence, low. Catherine Parr as an academic or best-selling memoirist. Sharp, intelligent, with distinctive jewelry that turns into a signature accessory. A public intellectual who survives and speaks. Speculative. Confidence in portrait identity, high. Henry VIII as two people in one, a young, charismatic CEO with auburn hair and athletic bearing, and an older political titan whose weight and chronic health problems have reshaped his public image, both recognizable as the same man across decades, and both constructed carefully for audiences. Speculative translation of historical reconstruction. Confidence in period imagery. High. Final recap and what to take away. Facial reconstruction isn't magic. It's careful, evidence-based interpretation. For some of Henry's wives, Jane Seymour and Catherine Parr, surviving portraits and documentary cross-checks let us speak with reasonable confidence about proportions, demeanor, and identity. For others, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the fog of lost originals and contested attributions keeps certainty low, even if structural features, a long neck, a slim face, are likely. Anne of Cleves reminds us how a single diplomatic portrait could be read in wildly different ways. And Catherine of Aragon shows how national stereotypes get layered onto faces in ways historians must peel back. Always look for the evidence base. Which portrait or medal informed the reconstruction? What contemporary description supports color or scar claims, and how confident scholars are about attribution. When reconstructions are presented visually, they should carry on-screen labels listing primary sources and a confidence rating. That transparency allows viewers to appreciate both the skill behind the reconstruction and its limits. If one thing stands out, it's this. History is a kind of detective work. Faces anchor us emotionally. They make the past human. But the faces we reconstruct are conversations between artists, diplomats, and modern scholars across 5 centuries, full of nuance, debate, and yes, fascination. Which reconstruction surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments. Was it Catherine's likely lighter tones, Anne Boleyn's enduring mystery, or Henry's dramatic transformation? If you want a deeper dive, check the playlist linked after this video, where we unpack Holbein's technique, read ambassadorial dispatches, and walk through the restoration science behind contested portraits. If you enjoyed this episode, like, subscribe, and ring the bell so the next reconstruction lands in your feed. Thanks for joining this visual detective story. Henry VIII and his wives dive into the fascinating facial reconstructions revealed.